There is a small yellow box of borax sitting on a shelf in an old farmhouse laundry room, right next to the washboard and a bar of homemade soap. The box itself is unremarkable, a little dusty at the edges, the kind of thing that has probably sat in that exact spot for years without anyone giving it a second thought. If you have spent any time in gardening groups online, you have probably seen the claim that follows a box just like this one everywhere it goes. 2 spoons of it, dissolved in water and poured around a tomato plant, and that plant will supposedly explode with fruit, outproducing anything a garden center fertilizer ever managed, for less than the cost of a single cup of coffee. Millions of people have shared that claim, screenshotted it, saved it for next spring. Almost none of them have been told the other half of the story, the half that explains why so many of those same gardeners quietly posted a follow-up photo a few weeks later of a tomato plant with scorched, yellowing leaves and no fruit at all. This video is not going to hand you that 2-spoon recipe and send you off to dump it on every tomato plant you own, no matter how satisfying that shortcut sounds on a thumbnail. I want to be upfront about that from the very first minute, because what I am about to show you instead is more useful, more honest, and frankly a little more interesting than a kitchen cabinet shortcut. The real story involves a nutrient most gardeners have never thought twice about, a narrow margin between helpful and harmful that catches more people off guard than almost any other substance in a garden, and an old-world habit of patience that the modern version of this trick conveniently leaves out. By the end, you will understand exactly why some tomato plants struggle to set fruit, what role this particular mineral actually plays, and the careful, old-fashioned way to find out whether your soil even needs it before you add a single spoonful of anything. Picture your own tomato plants for a moment, heavy with yellow blossoms in June, looking exactly the way a magazine photo says they should. And then nothing happens. The blossoms dry up and drop to the ground one by one, scattered in the mulch like confetti from a party that never started. The plant grows taller, bushier, greener than ever, but the fruit count stays embarrassingly low. You water on schedule. You bought the tomato-specific fertilizer with the bright red label promising bigger yields. You may have even tried a blossom set spray from the garden center, the kind that costs $12 or $15 for a small bottle that barely lasts the season, plus a granular feed every few weeks that adds up to $30 or $40 more before the summer is over. And still by August, your neighbor's plants are bending under the weight of fruit, while yours look healthy but stubbornly, frustratingly empty, and you start wondering whether the problem is something nobody at the garden center ever bothered to mention. That frustration is exactly why a claim like the borax trick spreads as fast as it does. It promises a single, cheap, dramatic fix to a problem that feels mysterious and unfair, and it arrives looking like the kind of secret a grandmother might have known all along. The trouble is that most poor fruit set in tomatoes has almost nothing to do with the nutrient that claim is built around, and pouring more of it into soil that already has plenty can do real, lasting damage to a garden bed, sometimes for more than one season. In many old rural households, the approach to anything added to garden soil was built on a habit that modern shortcuts skip entirely. Watch first, test before you guess, and never assume more of something is automatically better. An old farmer or gardener who had worked the same plot of ground for 30 years did not need a laboratory to notice when something was off. They knew their soil by its color, its smell after rain, which weeds grew thick in which corners, and how last year's crop in that same bed had performed. They built that soil up slowly, season after season, with compost, aged manure, crushed eggshells, and wood ash used sparingly, rather than reaching for a single concentrated powder and hoping for a dramatic overnight transformation. That patience was not a lack of knowledge. It was the knowledge. It also did not require an internet connection, a screenshot, or a stranger's word that a kitchen ingredient would work miracles on a plant that stranger had never actually seen growing in your particular yard, in your particular soil, under your particular weather that particular season. I think of an elderly gardener I once spent an afternoon with, tending a kitchen garden behind a farmhouse that had fed the same family for 4 generations. She kept a small notebook, the pages soft and curled from years of handling, recording what she planted where and how each bed had performed the year before. Some pages had pressed leaves tucked between them. A few had water stains from being carried out to the garden in a light rain. And every page was filled with the same small, careful handwriting, noting which corner of the garden had struggled the year the rain came late, and which bed had finally turned productive after 3 seasons of steady compost. When I asked her about boron specifically, the mineral at the center of that viral borax claim, she shook her head and told me plainly that she had never once added it to her tomatoes in 50 years of growing them, because her soil, built up with compost and manure for half a century, had never shown the slightest sign of needing it. She was far more concerned, she said, with watering consistently and keeping the soil from drying out, and then flooding again every time it rained, because that swing, she had learned through decades of close observation, was a much more common cause of dropped blossoms than anything a tomato plant was lacking in its soil. She pulled an old tomato plant gently aside to show me the mulch underneath, thick and even, and told me that most of what people now call a fertilizer problem, she had simply always called paying attention. Here is the part most people misunderstand, and it matters enormously before we go any further. Most people assume a struggling tomato plant is missing something it needs added. It usually is not. The real problem, the overwhelming majority of the time, is one of a small handful of things that have nothing to do with boron at all. Inconsistent watering that stresses the plant during flowering, daytime temperatures that climb above roughly 90 degrees, or nighttime temperatures that drop below the mid-50s, both of which can cause tomato pollen to become less viable right when the flower needs it most. Too much nitrogen fertilizer pushing the plant to grow lush green leaves instead of flowers and fruit, or simply not enough pollinator activity or air movement to knock pollen loose from flower to flower. Boron deficiency in tomatoes is real, but it is genuinely uncommon in garden soil that already receives regular compost or organic matter, and it shows up as a fairly specific set of symptoms: brittle or hollow stems, distorted new growth, and small, oddly cracked or rough-skinned fruit, not simply low fruit count on an otherwise healthy-looking plant. But knowing the real causes is only half the story. The other half, the part almost nobody walks you through, is what actually happens inside a tomato plant when boron levels swing too far in either direction, and why that swing happens so much more easily than most gardeners expect. Now let's talk about why boron in particular deserves more caution than almost any other nutrient a home gardener might consider adding, because the science here matters more than the viral version of this story ever explains. Boron is one of the trace minerals plants genuinely need, playing a role in moving sugars through the plant and helping form healthy cell walls, which is why severe deficiency really can affect fruit development. But agronomists and soil scientists have long pointed out something specific about boron that sets it apart from nutrients like nitrogen or potassium. The range between not enough and too much is unusually narrow. With many nutrients, a gardener can apply somewhat more than necessary, and the plant simply uses what it needs and tolerates the rest. With boron, that same kind of overshoot can tip a plant from healthy into damaged within a fairly small range, because the line between helpful and toxic sits much closer together than most people expect. Think of it this way. Adding extra nitrogen to slightly nitrogen-poor soil is a little like adding an extra cup of water to a recipe that called for a bit more liquid than you had on hand. Forgiving, easy to adjust, rarely ruinous. Adding extra boron to soil that did not need it is closer to adding an extra pinch of a strong spice to a delicate sauce, where the difference between just right and ruined is a fraction of what most people would guess. That is the whole game with this particular mineral. And it is the part the 2-spoon recipe leaves out entirely. That is the part most kitchen cabinet gardening posts never bother to mention, because a warning label does not spread nearly as fast as a promise. That is the whole reason serious growers test before they add anything containing boron, rather than guessing with a kitchen spoon. Borax itself is sodium borate, and the strength of the version sold in the laundry aisle is not formulated, measured, or diluted with garden soil chemistry in mind at all. A scoop that looks small in a measuring spoon translates into a concentrated dose once it dissolves into the much smaller volume of soil immediately around a single plant's roots. especially if it is not mixed evenly through a wider area first. That unevenness, more than the total amount used, is one of the most common reasons a borax application meant to help a tomato plant instead leaves it with scorched, yellowing leaf edges, stunted new growth, or a sudden halt in fruit production within a couple of weeks. And because boron does not flush out of soil quickly, particularly in clay-heavy soil or during a dry summer with little rain to help it disperse, a single overcorrection can leave a garden bed too boron-rich for the following season as well, long after the original tomato plant is gone. So here is the actual method, the one that takes a little more patience than 2 spoons in a watering can, but actually tells you the truth about your soil instead of guessing. Start with a soil test, not a recipe. A simple home soil test kit, available at most garden centers and hardware stores for somewhere between $15 and $25, will tell you your soil's pH and give you a rough read on major nutrients, though most basic home kits do not test specifically for boron. For that, your best and most affordable option is your local agricultural extension office, often connected to a state university, where a soil sample sent in by mail typically costs somewhere between $10 and $25 and comes back with a detailed breakdown of your soil's actual nutrient levels, including trace minerals, along with specific recommendations for your region and soil type. This is, genuinely, the closest thing to the old farmer's 50 years of careful observation that a modern gardener with no family history on a particular plot of land can access quickly. When that report comes back, look specifically for a line labeled boron, usually given in parts per million, alongside a note describing whether that reading falls below, within, or above the typical sufficient range for vegetable crops in your region. Most reports for ordinary garden soil that has received any compost or organic matter over the years will come back showing an adequate or even high reading, not a deficient one, which on its own answers the question the viral recipe never bothers to ask. If you are gardening in containers rather than an in-ground bed, treat the soil test results with even more caution before adding anything boron-related, since potting mix has a much smaller total volume to dilute any amendment into, and a rate that would be perfectly safe spread across an open garden bed can become concentrated and damaging far more quickly inside a single pot. While you wait on results, focus on the changes that fix the overwhelming majority of poor fruit set problems, regardless of what your soil test eventually shows. Water deeply and consistently, aiming for roughly 1 to 1.5 inches per week, delivered slowly, rather than in a quick daily splash, since tomatoes that swing between drought-stressed and waterlogged drop blossoms far more often than plants kept evenly moist. A simple way to check without any equipment is to push a finger 2 or 3 inches into the soil near the root zone. If it comes out dry at that depth, it is time to water deeply, rather than giving the surface a quick splash that never reaches the roots that actually need it. Mulch around the base of the plant with straw, shredded leaves, or grass clippings a few inches deep, which helps the soil hold that moisture steadily through hot afternoons and reduces the wide swings in soil temperature that also stress flowering plants. Cut back on nitrogen-heavy fertilizer once flowering begins, since a plant pushed to grow more leaves during its fruiting stage is often a plant that sets less fruit, not more. On very hot days, especially in regions where afternoon temperatures regularly climb into the 90s, some gardeners find light afternoon shade cloth over the flowering stage genuinely helps preserve pollen viability during the worst heat of the day. And if pollinator activity in your yard seems low, gently shaking or tapping the main stem of a flowering tomato plant once a day, mimicking the vibration a bee would normally provide, can meaningfully improve pollination in a yard without much bee traffic. If, and only if, your soil test specifically comes back showing a genuine boron deficiency, follow the rate listed on your test results or a labeled garden product formulated for that purpose, rather than a fixed measurement from a viral post. Extension guidance for confirmed boron deficiency typically describes very small total amounts spread across a fairly wide area of garden bed, not concentrated doses poured around a single plant, and the recommendation is almost always to mix it thoroughly and evenly into the soil across that whole area before planting, rather than applying it as a liquid drench directly at the base of an already growing plant. Apply it once per season at the recommended rate, then retest the following year before considering doing it again, since this is one of the rare garden amendments where doing it twice without confirming you actually need it the second time is far riskier than simply skipping a season entirely and waiting for next year's results. For the slower, steadier trace mineral support that most tomato beds actually benefit from, lean on the old-fashioned approach instead of a single concentrated powder, the same approach that built soil fertility for generations before anyone had a name for parts per million. Crushed eggshells, dried and ground finely, release calcium slowly over the season and can help with the kind of fruit bottom blackening known as blossom end rot, which is far more commonly a calcium and watering consistency issue than a boron issue, despite how often the two get confused online. Save shells through the winter, rinse and dry them, then crush them as fine as you can manage with a rolling pin or a blender before working them into the soil at planting time, since whole or large shell fragments break down far too slowly to do much good in a single growing season. A tablespoon of Epsom salt, which is magnesium sulfate, dissolved in a gallon of water and applied once a month during fruiting, can help in soil that is genuinely magnesium poor, and it carries a far wider margin of safety than borax does, though it should still be used based on an actual soil reading rather than a blanket habit. Finished compost, worked into a bed every season, supplies a broad, gentle spread of trace minerals in a form plants take up gradually rather than all at once, which is precisely the slow-building approach that kept that 50-year garden productive without a single application of laundry borax. Now the mistake that ruins this for the people who do try a boron-related fix without testing first. Treating every case of poor tomato yield as a boron problem means real issues: inconsistent watering, excess nitrogen, heat stress during flowering, low pollinator activity, calcium-related blossom end rot, go undiagnosed and unaddressed, while the gardener focuses entirely on the wrong fix. This is the single most common reason the borax trick gets credited for results it never actually produced, or blamed for failures that were never really its fault in either direction, because almost nobody trying it has actually confirmed what their soil needed in the first place. A second mistake is applying any boron-containing amendment as a concentrated liquid poured directly around the base of one plant, rather than mixed evenly across a wider bed before planting. Concentrated localized application is exactly how a technically small total amount becomes locally toxic right where the roots are trying to absorb water and nutrients, scorching the very plant it was meant to help. This is, in fact, exactly how the viral version of the recipe is almost always described and demonstrated: dissolved in a small amount of water and poured straight around one plant's base, which is precisely the application method most likely to concentrate the dose right where it can do the most damage. A third mistake is repeating the application the following season out of habit, assuming that if a little helped, doing it again must help more. Because boron lingers in soil rather than washing away quickly, a second application without retesting is one of the fastest ways to push soil that was previously fine straight into a toxic range, sometimes affecting not just tomatoes, but anything else planted in that bed for a year or more afterward. A fourth mistake worth mentioning is confusing the appearance of a boron-deficient plant with a calcium-deficient one, since both can show some distorted new growth and fruit abnormalities. Blossom end rot, that sunken, dark, leathery patch on the bottom of an otherwise normal-looking tomato, is overwhelmingly a calcium and watering consistency problem, not a boron problem, and treating it with borax instead of consistent watering and a calcium source like crushed eggshells or agricultural lime will not fix it, and may introduce a new boron problem on top of the original calcium one. A fifth mistake is applying any amendment, boron or otherwise, in the heat of summer when a plant is already showing stress signs like wilting or sun scald, rather than at planting time or during the cooler, more stable conditions of early spring. A stressed plant absorbs and reacts to anything added to its root zone less predictably than a healthy one, which means the same technically correct amount can hit a heat-stressed plant much harder than it would have earlier in the season. Old gardeners tended to do their soil building in early spring, or even the previous fall, long before a plant was already struggling, precisely so the soil had time to settle and even out before anything was expected to grow in it. I want to be completely plain about the limits here, because trust matters more than a satisfying before and after photo. No single amendment, boron, magnesium, calcium, or anything else, will turn an unhealthy, stressed, poorly watered tomato plant into a record-breaking producer by itself. Soil amendments work alongside consistent watering, reasonable sun exposure, healthy pollinator activity, and a soil that has been built up over time, not as a replacement for any of those things. If your garden soil has been heavily worked or chemically treated for years, or if you are gardening in an area with known industrial contamination, a professional soil test through your extension office or a certified lab is worth the small cost before adding anything at all, including compost from an unknown source. Keep any concentrated borax or boron product away from children and pets. Store it the same way you would any household chemical rather than a garden amendment, and never mix it with other fertilizers or amendments without checking whether the combination is recommended, since stacking multiple concentrated products at once is a common way gardeners accidentally overshoot a safe range without realizing it. If a soil test reveals contamination, severe nutrient imbalance, or anything beyond ordinary garden chemistry, that is a conversation for a local extension agent or a professional, not a home recipe. I also want to say plainly that this is not the kind of mistake that sends anyone to the hospital. A spoonful of borax in garden soil is not a household poisoning emergency the way swallowing a concentrated cleaning product might be, and I do not want to overstate the danger here. The real cost of getting this wrong is almost always a damaged plant, a wasted season, or a garden bed that needs a year or two to recover, not a medical emergency. That is precisely why it is worth doing carefully, rather than skipping the testing step entirely. A mistake here costs you tomatoes, not safety, but a wasted season of tomatoes, after the watering, the staking, the weeding, and the waiting, is still a real loss worth avoiding if a $15 test can prevent it. Now ask yourself a simple question. If a $15 soil test and a little patience genuinely outperforms a viral 2-spoon recipe, why does the recipe spread so much faster than the careful version ever does? Part of the answer is simply that a dramatic claim travels further online than a careful one, regardless of who first wrote it down. And that has nothing to do with any company burying anything. But there is a real, more uncomfortable layer underneath that too. A fertilizer company has very little reason to tell you that your soil might not need their product at all this season, and an extension office offering a $10 soil test has nowhere near the marketing reach of a brightly labeled bottle promising bigger tomatoes on a garden center shelf. The blanket fertilizer model, sold by the bag regardless of what any individual yard actually needs, profits from you adding something every season, whether your soil is short on it or not. A soil test that might tell you to add nothing at all this year does not have anyone's advertising budget behind it, because there is no product to sell at the end of that advice. It is worth being honest that the borax claim itself did not come from a fertilizer company trying to bury anything. It mostly spread the way folk remedies always have, one shared post at a time, repeated because it sounded plausible and cost almost nothing to try. The actual thing quietly left out of the conversation is not a corporate secret at all. It is simply the slower, less shareable truth that a soil test and a season of consistent watering will outperform almost any single additive. And that kind of advice has never once gone viral, because there is no dramatic before and after photo in the words, "Your soil was probably fine all along." This careful, test-first approach works the same way whether you are growing a few tomato plants in containers on an apartment balcony, tending a single raised bed in a small suburban backyard, or managing a full vegetable garden on a rural property. Container gardens in particular benefit enormously from this approach, since potting soil starts out fairly uniform, and a boron mistake in a small enclosed container volume can affect a plant far more quickly and severely than the same mistake spread across an open garden bed. Community garden plots, often shared by multiple gardeners over the years, with no consistent record of what has been added to the soil, are exactly the kind of unknown history where a soil test is worth far more than any viral shortcut, since you genuinely do not know what previous gardeners may have already added. A newly purchased home with an existing garden bed left behind by the previous owner falls into that same category, since you have no way of knowing what that bed has received over the years until a test tells you. Even a brand new raised bed, filled with fresh bagged garden soil straight from the store, is worth a baseline test after its first season, since bagged soil blends vary quite a bit by brand and region, and starting with an accurate picture in year one saves a great deal of guessing in every year that follows. There is something worth sitting with here, beyond tomatoes and trace minerals. The instinct behind that 2-spoon recipe, the desire for one cheap, dramatic, immediate fix to a frustrating problem, is completely understandable, and it is the same instinct that has always made shortcuts attractive in every generation, not just this one. What the old gardener with her 50-year notebook understood, without ever needing a viral post to tell her, is that a garden rewards patient observation far more reliably than it rewards a single bold gesture. She did not get better tomatoes by finding the right powder. She got better tomatoes by paying attention, season after season, to what her own particular patch of ground was actually telling her, and adjusting in small, careful amounts based on what she saw, rather than what she hoped. There is also a kind of relief in that approach. Once you sit with it for a minute, you are not failing as a gardener if your tomato plant struggles, and the answer turns out to be something as ordinary as inconsistent watering or a stretch of unusually hot nights, rather than a missing secret ingredient. Most of gardening is not about finding the one hidden trick nobody told you. It is about a handful of unglamorous, repeatable habits, done consistently, season after season. The same handful of habits that old notebook recorded in careful handwriting, decades before anyone filmed a video about it.